Most people learn a simple ending. The Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. But here's the twist. If you had told that to millions of people living around the Mediterranean, centuries later, they would have stared at you like you'd lost your mind. Because as far as they were concerned, Rome was still alive. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, as a functioning empire with emperors, courts, taxes, armies, law, diplomacy, and a capital city that looked like a jewel box of stone and gold. This is the story of the empire we call Byzantine, an empire that called itself something else, Rome. Let's start with a date that changed everything, 330 CE. That's when Emperor Constantine rededicated an ancient Greek city on the Bosporus and turned it into a new imperial capital, Constantinople, a strategic choke point between Europe and Asia. And this wasn't some provincial outpost. It was built for power, deep harbors, defensible geography, and access to the wealthier eastern provinces. Now jump forward. 410 CE, the Visigoths sack Rome. Shocking, yes, but it didn't end Rome everywhere. The Eastern Empire thrived while the West fell apart. And by 476, the last Western emperor was deposed. But in Constantinople, emperors continued to reign for roughly 1,000 more years, until 1453. So the real question isn't, why did Rome fall? It's, how did Rome survive? And why do we rarely call it Rome? Visitors from the frontier wrote about Constantinople like it was a city from a different universe. Not just because it was rich, but because it felt engineered to overwhelm. Imagine entering a throne hall where everything is designed to say, you are standing before the center of the world. Accounts describe elaborate ceremonial displays, automata, mechanical devices, controlled lighting, music, and staged movement stools of imperial theater. Not magic, not myth, statecraft. And beneath the spectacle was continuity. The empire preserved and adapted Roman law, imperial administration, and a professional bureaucracy that could actually run a state across generations. But empires don't survive on palaces alone. For ordinary people, life had rhythms that would have felt familiar to earlier Romans. Farming, trade, workshops, port labor, textiles, ceramics, fishing, the machinery of daily survival. Constantinople was also a magnet for commerce. Grain routes, silk, spices, metalwork, glass, and economic ecosystem that fed the capital and paid for armies. And yes, silk becomes a major story. By the early Middle Ages, the empire becomes a serious player in silk production and luxury goods, which meant more revenue and more leverage in diplomacy. If you want one symbol of Rome continued, you go here, Hagia Sophia. It was built under Emperor Justinian I and completed in 537 CE, a statement in stone that the empire wasn't shrinking into history. It was rewriting history. The dome seems to float. Light pools in the interior like it's pouring in from another world. People described it in cosmic language because they didn't have modern engineering vocabulary for what they were seeing. And it wasn't only churches. The empire maintained roads, aqueducts, fortifications, especially the massive defensive walls of Constantinople, which helped the city resist sieges for centuries. This is one of the keys to the empire's survival. They treated defense as infrastructure, not an afterthought. The empire also produced serious intellectual life: philosophy, theology, law, history, mathematics. And it built systems for speed and warning, including long-distance signaling networks beacons that could transmit alerts across large distances far faster than messengers could ride. Think about the strategic advantage. If border forces spot an invasion, the center can prepare quickly moving troops, tightening defenses, controlling supplies. And later, in the 12th century, we get one of the most important voices in Byzantine history, Anna Karenine, an imperial princess who wrote the Alexiad, a critical source for understanding the politics and conflicts of her era. including the world around the First Crusade. An empire that documents itself, an empire that preserves institutions, leaves behind something more than ruins. It leaves behind continuity. Now, don't mistake this for a fairy tale of endless prosperity. The empire faced waves of crisis, wars with Persia, the rapid expansion of new powers in the region, internal religious conflicts, political coups, and civil wars. So how did it keep going? By adapting, changing military recruitment, shifting to new defensive strategies, using diplomacy like a weapon, turning rivals against each other, and leveraging the fact that Constantinople was extraordinarily hard to take. For centuries, enemies could win battles, but they couldn't easily win the city, until one moment when the danger didn't come from the direction anyone expected. In the early 1200s, a crusading army deep in debt and tangled in politics gets pulled into Byzantine power struggles. A claimant promises money and support if they help him seize the throne. It works, briefly. Then Constantinople erupts in revolt. The claimant falls, and the crusaders, unpaid, angry, and armed, turn on the city itself. In 1204, Constantinople is captured and brutally sacked. Fires rage, treasures vanish. Libraries and artworks are destroyed or scattered. It is one of the most devastating events in medieval history because it fractures the empire's economic and political core. And here is the irony. The city that survived so many external enemies is shattered by an army that came wearing the language of faith. The Romans do retake the city in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos, but restoration isn't the same as recovery. The empire that returns to Constantinople isn't the same giant that once commanded the Mediterranean. It's a state fighting for oxygen surrounded by rivals, drained economically and politically fragile. Finally comes 1453. Ottoman forces under Mehmed II later, called the Conqueror, capture Constantinople after a decisive siege. The last emperor dies in the defense, and that's the conclusive end of the empire that called itself Rome. But identities don't collapse as neatly as walls do. For centuries, Greek-speaking Christians in the region continued to use the word Roman in their self-identity Romaio, Romans long after the imperial state was gone. So why do we call them Byzantines? Because centuries later, Western European scholars wanted neat categories. Classical Rome was Latin, pagan, ancient. Medieval Rome was Greek, Christian, complicated. To create a clean break, they reached for an older name tied to the city's ancient past, Byzantium, and from that, Byzantine. The label helped people tell a story of loss and rediscovery during the Renaissance. But it also hid a truth. Rome didn't just fall. Rome transformed and kept going. And if you think that's surprising, wait until you see how this empire's ideas, law, religion, diplomacy, even art kept shaping Europe and the Middle East long after 1453. Because sometimes, the most powerful empires don't conquer by armies. They conquer by inheritance. Want to explore more cool history videos? Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below.